Welcome to the first plenary address of the 2021 History Access online graduate conference. We have had a wonderful and engaging first day so far, 2 panels with 6 amazing presentations by our emergent researchers and a lively special lecture by another young academic. And now Professor Jacob Dlamini is joining us from Princeton University. Thank you, Jacob, for accepting our invitation and for making the time in your very busy schedule. It's early in New Jersey and we are truly delighted. Since the publication of Native Nostalgia in 2009, Professor Dlamini has continued to challenge the received narratives of modern South African history sharply, forcefully, effectively, and yet with a sensitivity to the quotidian life world that has been in real short supply in academic histories. In one book after another, he has continued to impress us, intrigue us, provoke us, unsettle us, call our bluffs, and point us at directions that had not received sustained critical attention. I particularly remember how his 2014 book, Askari, A Story of Collaboration and Betrayal in the Anti-Apartheid Struggle, triggered many discussions and almost uncontrollable debates in our classrooms and staff rooms alike. With the publication of Terrorist Album, Apartheid's Insurgents, Collaborators, and the Security Police in 2020, and most recently of Safari Nation, A Social History of the Kruger National Park, Professor Dlamini has once again shifted the boundaries of our conversations, redefined our academic foci, and productively complicated our complacence. We are delighted that he is going to speak today at the History Access annual conference on race and history. It is with great pleasure I invite and thank you, Jacob, once again. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Carr, for extending this generous invitation. And thank you all for being here this morning. I'm going to share some thoughts with you on, I think, what many of us, and I'm going to make some assumptions here. And of course, I'm open to challenge and to correction in the Q&A. So I'm going to make assumptions about what many of us see as a problem. And that problem, just crudely put, is that 24 years or 25 years into a democracy, the historical discipline, the profession of history in South Africa is still dominated by people who in the past were classified or still are classified as white. I think many of us take this superficially as a political problem, and some might even want to extend it into questions of historiography, right, and to raise questions about the implications of the fact that white scholars dominate history as a discipline, as a profession in South Africa, right? Might push us in that direction. Sorry, I'm just losing my thought for a second. But let me just start with that basic assumption. And so I just want to qualify the presentation I'm going to give today by saying that this is very much a work in progress. In fact, I'm not even sure if it's a work. It's just a series of thoughts and concerns and questions that I have in hopes that through conversation with you, I might come to a better understanding of what it is I'm trying to do, if there's anything at all that I'm trying to do with this. And so that's what is at the heart of my concern here. The fact that more than 25 years after the end of apartheid, white scholars continue to dominate the historical discipline and history as a profession. The last time I gave a talk along these lines, I actually had help from the Council on Higher Education because they had some statistics that I could use. But when I went back to them to see if they had anything recent for me to work with, they actually didn't have any. In fact, I couldn't even find the person that I'd worked with previously. So I actually don't know what the figures are. So I just want to qualify this, other than just, anecdotally. I also know that up until, was it 4 years ago, I think when I last, spoke along these lines, the numbers did bear out the claims I'm about to make today, that white scholars continue to dominate history as a profession. And I want to actually, instead of just stating this as a claim, stating this as a fact, I want to actually pose this to you as a question. So is this a problem? And if it is a problem, why is it a problem? And what kind of problem is it? Right? Because I moved from this assumption, as I said earlier, that we all share at some level this political discomfort with the fact that whites continue to dominate history in South Africa. But what exactly is the source of this discomfort, right? Is it that these scholars are classified white, or is it that these scholars don't? In fact, many of them, speak any of the indigenous languages except for Afrikaans in most cases. Or is it that these are people of European descent, whose claim to indigeneity, has never been fully accepted, right? And so I'm just posing this as a series of questions. But just to frame my discussion, I'm going to just read some things for you, and hopefully we can use this as a launching pad into a discussion, right? And I'm going to start with the man by the name of Theo Soga. In 1862, Theo Soga welcomed the launch of an English Xhosa newspaper called Iphepha Bazasekhaya with the following words, and I quote, "I envisage in this newspaper a beautiful vessel for preserving the stories, fables, legends, customs, anecdotes, and history of the tribes," close quote. Soga, the first African from the Cape to be ordained a minister in the Scottish Presbyterian Church, called on subscribers to bound the newspaper's copies together as this would, and I quote again, "make a precious inheritance for generations of growing children," close quote. Soga said veterans of the Xhosa and Embu people must, I quote again, "disgorge all they know. Everything must be imparted to the nation as a whole. Fables retold, history recounted," close quote. Right. And it's interesting to notice here that Soga draws a distinction between myths and history. Right. It's interesting to notice that he sees these as two distinct media. Right. In 1919, to tell another story, educationist and political activist John Dube said, and I'm quoting here, "If there were native historians, surely we would be reading a different history to what is doled out to us," close quote. Right. In 1952, another educationist and political activist, this time Z.K. Matthews, had this to say, and I'm quoting, "I do not know if it is possible to approach history without bias. But if it is necessary to accept that all history is biased, the important thing is that all biases be represented. And it is high time that African history, written from the African point of view, takes its place on library shelves," close quote. Right? And these are the only people to raise this as a concern. Right? In 1977, for example, Rodney Davenport, historian, formidable historian from South Africa, lamented the absence of Black historians in South Africa. In 1988, Ian Smith, not the Rhodesian Ian Smith, sorry, noted the, and I quote here, "peculiar absence of a major contribution as yet from African South Africans to the historiography of a country which is the most developed and urbanized in Africa," close quote. Right. In that same year, Gail Gerhardt makes a similar observation in her book on Black politics, in South Africa. Right. To his credit, Smith said his comment about the absence of Black historians did not mean that he was calling for a narrow approach to history writing. And I'm quoting him here, "One does not have to believe that only Blacks can write Black history to acknowledge that a crucial dimension is still largely missing from South African historiography, without which it is greatly impoverished," close quote. Smith predicted that when Black historians did show up eventually, they were likely to upset the apple carts of a fair number of white historians. In 2006, historian Cynthia Cross takes up the same concern, and she points to the absence of Black historians from the discipline. Cross lauded social history's translation, this was her word, of ordinary voices. But she predicted that this work of translation by third-party academics was, and I'm quoting here, "likely to become complicated and enriched by the greater influx of African language-speaking historians into the profession." By 2010, Jane Carruthers, another formidable historian, was also drawing attention to the absence of Black historians from the discipline. Speaking of his generation of students at the University of Fort Hare, Z.K. Matthews said, and I'm quoting him, "As African students in a land dominated by Europeans, we were in a peculiarly uncomfortable position. Our history, as we'd absorbed it from the tales and talks of our elders, bore no resemblance to South African history as it has been written by European scholars, or as it is taught in South African schools, and as it was taught to us at Fort Hare." Remember, he's writing in the 1950s, 1952. Matthews compared himself and his classmates to American boys forced to study the US War of Independence from the perspective of the British. And this is what he says, I'm quoting. "So we approach history as one does an unavoidable ordeal, all steeled up and determined to get through it somehow." Close quote. He went further, and I'm quoting here extensively. "History reached us in a murmur of muffled voices, some telling us preposterous lies about Africa, others suggesting promises out of the European past itself, which we did not quite dare take as applying to our future. It is hardly surprising, therefore, that Western educated Africans have until now largely skirted history as a field of work. There are a few who may be the first to break the ground, but they face the danger, I think, of falling into the same traps of bias in which so many European scholars are caught." Close quote. Excuse me. In 2012, Shula Marx spoke of the revisionist history that, from the 1960s on, challenged what she called the white version of African history. But as she pointed out, this revisionist history was researched and written almost exclusively by white historians. To the question why this was so, Marx answered, and I'm quoting here, "Inevitably, the deliberate stunting of Black education by nationalist party governments before 1990 meant that the country produced far too few Black scholars in general, and even fewer Black historians in particular." Close quote. Marx called history, quote, "a much hated discipline with few Black takers." Close quote. So what then of the few Black takers of this much hated discipline? How are we to respond to calls for new approaches to the study of South African history and for fresh perspectives on the historiography of apartheid? This project, this work in progress, is a draft of my response to that call. And of course, the questioning, but also the concern about the relative absence of Black historians in South Africa has been taken up most, loudly, perhaps not eloquently, by what we might call the Forest movement. Starting in 2015, with the demands for the decolonization of education, in South Africa. But what then, if there is a problem, is this problem exactly? Right? Is it just the sheer numbers of white scholars who do history in Africa? Or is it something different, right? So Cynthia Cross, for example, he gets at something here when she talks about works of translation, right? When she talks about historians coming along with languages other than English and Afrikaans, right? But it's not quite clear to me what the concern is ultimately, right? If our pushback, if our objection is that there's just too many white historians, right? What is it about their work, right, that allows us to challenge what they're doing, right? Are we saying that because they're white, then their work can't be good enough? Or are we saying that because they're white, there are perspectives that they can't get at, right? And if these are perspectives they can't get at because they're white, is this a question of language or is it a question of something else? That is it a question of politics, is it a question of heritage? I don't know what the answers are to these questions, but these are just some of the questions that I'm grappling with. And of course, those of you who are familiar with the work I've done in the past will see, I think, intimations of some of my consistent concerns here. Right? One of which is this idea that race does all the explaining that we need it to do, right? That if a historian is white by definition, right? And of course, here I should point out that I'm using apartheid era definitions, right? But there's assumption that if a white historian is white by definition, there is objectively a limit to what that historian can do or say about the history of South Africa, right? But, and this is, one of my first claims, what this political objection to the disproportionate presence of white historians in South Africa seems to rest on, in my opinion, is, I think, another potentially dangerous assumption, which is that Black historians will come along and all will be righted, right? The Black historians will come along and South African history will be enriched. Yes, it will be enriched. The more historians are doing the work that needs doing, of course, there will be more perspectives on the table, right? But what I want to kick off the table is race as, in some ways, a determinant of one's positioning, a determinant of one's historiographical traditions and pursuits. Okay? Because it seems to me, and I think we see this most clearly in the demands that were made, in 2015, especially, by the fallists, that there is this automatic assumption that phenotype denotes perspective. Right? That to look one way is in some ways to know before that person even opens their mouth what they're going to say about our own history. Right? And this, to me, I think is far too dangerous an assumption to make about the place of race in the reinvigoration of history in South Africa. Right? There are a lot of white scholars who've done incredible work. Many of us stand on their shoulders, right? As we try and do the work that we're trying to do, as we try and question, some of the shibboleth that have come to in some ways to burden South African history, right? And so to dismiss them out of hand and to say that, well, because you're white, you can't do history, or because you're white, your voice doesn't count, is for me counterproductive. Right, and it's counterproductive in ways that I think assume that race works one way in this one capacity, but it actually works differently in another capacity. That if by definition someone is classified Black, their history will be by definition progressive. It will be by definition cutting edge, etc., etc. Right, and I don't know that I subscribe to that idea. Right, and so this is what I wanted to share with you. Right, that yes, race matters. Right, and of course, I don't need to remind you, I don't need to remind those of you who are in South Africa just how race matters, right? Race matters here in the US, but there's something particularly charged, right? And of course, I speak as a South African, there's something particularly charged about the ways in which race matters in South Africa, how one comports oneself on campus at UCT, at Wits, and many other places, how one interacts with one's professors. Yes, race matters. We can never, ignore that, and we should never, ever ignore that, right? But at the same time, we don't want to fall into these lazy and easy assumptions, right? That we just need to train more Black historians and, all will be right. We just need to train more Black historians and automatically Black historians will get it, right? In ways that white scholars don't get. Right? So this is the work that I'm actually trying to push towards. It's the work that I'm trying to do. I'm also trying to do this work to connect it to much more immediate concerns in ways that might help us break out of this mold whereby, white historians, if they're English speaking, will write about everyone else. Right? Afrikaans historians, if they identify as Afrikaans, will write on Afrikaner topics. Colored historians will write about, so-called colored topics. So-called African historians will write about so-called African topics. With English-speaking white South Africans writing about everyone else, right? We need to break out of this mode, right? We need to, in some ways, take seriously the contingent nature of South Africa as a nation, as a nation state, right? And there is, it seems to me, something of the nation state and its shadow, right, in the political concern that we have about the relative absence of Black historians, right? And this shows, I think, this intimate connection between history and the nation state, right? That we can trace back to 19th century European historiography, right? This idea that to write history is to put the nation on a pedestal, right? That to write history in some ways is to give an accounting of a particular nation, right? And I think the objection that many of us have politically to the relative absence of Black historians in South Africa is about this, right? Even though very few of us are explicit enough to say that actually this is part of what drives this concern, right? This idea that history is about the nation, right? And that the nation in South Africa is defined a particular way, right? Regardless of the fact that South Africa is by definition a contingent creation made up of people of different phenotypes, right? Made up of people, who come from different places, right? Historically, right? And this is absolutely important because there is, I think, a tendency to nativize, right? So-called Africans in South Africa to make it seem as if you are classified African, you don't have to explain yourself, right? You automatically belong. But if you're classified colored, if you're classified Indian, if you're classified white, you have some explaining to do about what it is that makes you best placed to make the claims you want to claim, about South Africa. And this is what I'm trying to challenge, right? In my challenging this, I'm trying to take us back to 1910. I'm trying to take us back to the mid-19th century, and to do that in ways that help us appreciate the importance of the contingent nature of South Africa as a nation state. South Africa has no prior pre-colonial history as such. Right? I'm stating the obvious here, but I think this is a point that is worth making. It's a point that's worth mentioning, and it's a point that I think that is worth repeating. Right? That South Africa as such has no pre-colonial history. Right? We have a pre-colonial history of the region, right, that can help enrich the stories we want to tell. Right? This is different. Right, from suggesting that the nation state as such has this pre-colonial history to which so-called Africans by definition automatically belong, that everyone else has some explaining to do. Right? So this is the work that I'm trying to do. And these are the remarks and these are the comments that I just wanted to share with you this morning. I'd like to stop there, Bodhi, if it's okay with you, so we can open this up for conversation. Because I imagine there will be a lot of objection to what I just said.
Thank you so much, Jacob. Yes, thank you. Let us take some questions, comments. Anandaru, please go ahead. Anandaru, you can pose your question. You are muted. If you are...
Hi. Sorry. Am I audible now?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. My computer is, I think, winding to an end after 2 years of the pandemic. Thank you, Professor Dlamini. I think it was a short, crisp, provocative, and lucid talk, and something I agree with completely. But there are a few things I just want to put out there as a, as something to think with you, because you're, as I understand, also thinking with this problem. The first is there a recede? Why do you think this is happening? Is there a receding of the economic questions in history, which allow a certain kind of particular definition of agency to come through, which allows this kind of appropriation or this kind of historical moment to emerge? Because of it's not so much a question. I mean, economy has always been related to a race, but in terms of the way in the last 25 years, it's not just in South Africa, but historiographically, the receding of economic history as a discipline, or big economic questions as a discipline, especially after the fall of, the Berlin Wall, perhaps, the more and more that receding that vacuum has been now filled with certain notions of agency, which allows this form of history writing to emerge. That's something which I was thinking about, because and here I'm thinking about a conversation that Sanjay Subramaniam, the foremost historian of the world, said something slightly tongue-in-cheek, but it stayed with me, that in response to some of the similar questions that probably you have been asked, where he said that I do not write histories to find myself in it. This is something which is actually rarer and rarer, that more and more people write histories to find themselves in it. And I think there's a connection between the receding of the economic structures and this search for finding oneself, and oneself defined in a very specific way, that creates a situation which allows this kind of historical moment to emerge. And finally, I just want to also to think about not just this is the larger economic global structural mode that you can think, but also this is something which I have kind of grappled with as a student of history, studying in South Asia, then now teaching in UCT in another part of the global South. That history as a discipline in itself, in terms of a larger economy, whether it be national or a local economy, it does not immediately lend itself to jobs. So it is only in the second or third generation, after a certain kind of consolidation of a certain, whether it be a black bourgeois or an emerging bourgeois, that can allow their children to then take a risk in studying something like history. So there is another interesting question that perhaps have to be dealt with, not just in terms of what intellectually historical knowledge means, but what historical discipline means as a young student to be, pursuing it, especially as a young Black student to be pursuing it. I'll just pause there, but I just want to congratulate your short, crisp, provocative speech, and it's wonderful to actually have you. And thank you.
No, Professor San, thank you so much for that. I think you're onto something, right? You're onto something that I think with the retrenchment, right? I think is a much stronger word, of the economic question, right? So, but alongside this retrenchment of the economic question, the entrenchment of inequality that is very much racialized in the South African context, right? Identity has come to assume a particular currency, right? And so this is a currency you have to trade, is a currency you have to deal with, and so you want to work this for for what it's worth, right? And so you end up, I think with these, in some ways, again, just to be provocative here, we end up with this fetishized, yearnings for agency, right? Forgetting, as Lynn Thomas reminds us, that agency itself has a history. Right, and so this is where I want to decouple history making, history writing from questions of phenotype. Right, this assumption that just because I look a particular way, if I go into the lowveld of South Africa and interview people who look like me, that somehow there's an intimate political connection immediately. Right, that there is a historic connection between me and the people I'm talking to. Right, and this. Nothing could be farther from the truth, right? It's only, I think, through this political fiction of nation making, right, that we have to assume this, obvious immediate correspondence, right, with people who look like us, right? But it's not helpful, and it's not always helpful. Right? Yes. So in some ways, fall into race as the big explainer, as the thing that will actually help us deal with the problems we face, is a dead end. And so this is part of what I'm trying to think my way through. Right? How to get out of this dead end of the dead end of assuming that race is what we need, to make sense of, both the present and the future, right? And of course, this is not to ignore, again, I can't say this enough, right? This is not to ignore the salience of race, right? Race matters, and it matters in the most profound ways, possible, right? Not just in South Africa, but in the world. This we know, right? But how do we do history in ways that allow us to raise all kinds of questions without assuming that we know what the answers are, right? Without assuming that with some groups of people there's no explaining that needs to take place, right? Because there is this immediately an automatic connection between the historian and the people that he or she is writing about, right? But your points are well taken. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Akambile Masola.
Hi, Jacob. Thank you so much for your provocations and your thoughts. And a lot of them resonate with a lot of conversations that I've been having with, I'd say, my peers, and in that sense, kind of a younger generation, like with first entry or second entry into academia, and having to really grapple with this because we are that kind of generation that's kind of making it in and having to encounter all these problems. And so my first kind of question or pushback in a sense is the challenge of centering whiteness in this conversation. And by that I mean is that I think there's a question that comes before we think about why are there white historians dominating the discipline, is that there's another question or a series of questions that come before that, and that this question is part of a broader conversation. Perhaps it's about history as a discipline, perhaps it's about the making of history in the past 200 years, but it's a wider conversation. And so I wonder, what are the other questions that you're asking yourself? And it's not so much that they're in an order going this way, but it seems to me you might fall into the trap of centering whiteness, which is not what you're doing, actually, is that you're provoking by using whiteness as the starting point. And perhaps to tag onto what Anandarup is saying, this idea of people seeing themselves in history, I think we mustn't downplay. In fact, while Anandarup was speaking, I was thinking of Toni Morrison, who is often quoted a lot for saying that she writes the books that she wants to read because she found herself not in the books that were designated American novel or American literature. And so I think history in the context that we find ourselves in is falling into that as well. It's not that people are wanting to find themselves in there, because then what it is that people like me who say we're doing Black women's historiography, it always feels biographical, and that it's not. It's not that I just simply want to see myself, is that I am answering to bigger political questions. But because of my phenotype, because of my gender, I am seen to be responding to, and so that undermines the work that I'm doing. And that it somehow seems as if people like me can only ever do this work. I mean, I could have been an astrophysicist, for goodness sake, but I happen to be interested in this thing. So I think, and then maybe the third point to that, and it's interesting that you start off with someone like Soga, because Soga himself was not a historian. Okoba were not historians. Omkai were not historians, but they find themselves doing the work of history. And so what's interesting for me is the challenge is actually the discipline of history, that is academic history, in a context where history itself has always been undisciplined, actually, is that it is a human question about how we become human, and that we know we exercise it in different places, not just the academy, because we know that the academy has its own problems. So if there is a problem in academia, for example, or in history as a discipline, it's not to say that there is a problem with, I don't know, Black history or whatever, the other kind of history that we want to talk about. It's that there's a problem with academic history, and that the work can happen outside of academic history. Is that when Black people do history or think about history, they don't need academic history or the discipline of history to help them, in a sense, or to respond to them. But actually, it seems to me that this crisis is here because of the space of what this thing of the academy is. And so if we're talking about the Soga and that tradition, that people have actually followed that, but it just happens to not find it finds itself in the church, maybe. It finds itself in communities, maybe. It finds itself in homes, in one way or the other. And I'm not convinced by that. I'm just making examples that it could be finding itself. And that's also maybe fine, is that academia needs to respond to its own crisis, making it the problem of other people, in a sense, because I think it needs to take responsibility for what it has done in light of what people like Osoga, Onkai, if we're looking at that tradition. I mean, there are many traditions, but I'm using that because that was the starting point.
Yeah, so I'm in complete agreement. I'm in complete agreement, and in some ways, I should have been more explicit here. That my focus is on, the profession and the discipline, right? That is on academic history, right? As such, this is my focus, right? And so, what, for example, am I using for some of the evidence that I need to support this anecdotal claim that white historians continue to dominate the profession? I simply look at the, was it like 21 universities in South Africa, however many there are now, right? And I look at the, history, heritage departments. And then, again, it's very superficially, but also very dangerously, like, go through the list and say, okay, so who's listed, right? As a member of staff, as a member of faculty, and can we superficially, like, looking at the names, like, figure out, who's white and who's not, right? So it's very superficial, largely because I don't have the figures that I've had in the past from the CHE, but it's also very limited to academic history in South Africa, right? So just looking at history department and saying, okay, so who's doing what kind of teaching, right? And as a proportion, right, of the rest, like, how big or how small, a group are we talking? So there's that going on, right? I mean, I certainly take your point. That history looks much more interesting when we take a much more expansive view of what history is, right? Because if you take a narrow view of what history is, then you're right, Soga falls out of the picture, right? His sons, as I think Cynthia was pointing out, fall out of the picture, right? There's a limit, Blackie himself falls out of the picture, right? If you take a narrow and a literally academic view of what history and history writing are, right? And it opens up and you take a much more expansive view. And of course, I am with you on the Toni Morrison point that the work that we do in some ways is an attempt to let voices that have not been heard in the past, the voices that have been heard but ignored in the past, matter, right? To have voices that have not counted in the past count, right? This is absolutely important. But what I don't want to read, but also what I want to appreciate without, letting this do too much work is the easy assumption that your gender and your so-called race, right, automatically give you insight into, African women in the mid-19th century. Right, when you didn't live in the mid-19th century, right? When there's a limit to how much you can know about that particular group of women. Because part of what I'm trying to disrupt is this idea that race flows neatly, right, from the mid-19th century into the present, right? That there's this uninterrupted flow that somehow you, by virtue of being a woman scholar, a female historian, can just tap into. Right. So this is part of what I'm trying to to disrupt. Right. There's very easy assumption. It's also why I'm making the point, and I think it's a point that bears repeating. That we have to take seriously, right, in our work on South African history. We have to take seriously its contingent creation, right? And of course, some of this applies to pretty much every nation state. Like no nation state is natural. Right? No nation state emerges fully formed into the world. Like it's a work of creation, it's a work of imagination, it's a work of politics, it's a work of economics, right? And we have to take this seriously. Right? We have to take this seriously. That South Africa is such. So that's what I mean. And of course, I'm fully with Caroline Hamilton here, and subscribe fully to her project, right, of recuperating these pre-colonial intellectual histories. Right? But of course, I think what we have to do is to decouple this pre-colonial intellectual histories from the nation state itself. Right? We have to appreciate them for what they are without assuming that they feed into the nation state. And of course, Caroline Hamilton is not doing this at all, right? I mean, this is part of what makes her work so pioneering, right? But I think there's a danger that younger scholars might come along and assume that if I can figure out what the intellectual history of the word power is in, say, mid-19th century, let's call it Zululand, right? Then I can figure out how people in the present think about some of these issues, right? And so this is part of what I'm trying to push against.
Thank you. Professor Caroline Hamilton.
Thanks very much. Jacob, your questions are really, a fabulous provocation, but also, a tricky one. I think my own answer to it, a bit like the way Atambile is immediately responding to decenter the whiteness, which I think in some sense is exactly what you're trying to do, in fact, is that about 2 decades ago, it struck me that the kinds of questions that my Black students naturally, just instinctively brought to the academic historical exercise, the things they were interested in, were confounded by the very concept of archive, which was entrenched at the heart of the historical academic exercise. And there's a maneuver that makes it doubly difficult. And the maneuver is that it appears, wrongly, in my view, that that concept of archive is somehow mitigated by a recognition of oral tradition. But actually, I would make the argument that the very concept itself, oral tradition, is a particular kind of notion which is invented in response to the very concept of archive that is the problem. Therefore, it is a double problem. And the double problem is that there's the archive and then, the old people are archives. We can solve this problem by resorting to that source. And I think that the paralyzing conundrum lies in this articulation. In other words, the original archival problem is made worse by that problem, which is not to say that I for a second devalue or discount oral accounts, not at all, absolutely not. I mean, the absolutely critical forms. But the method, once you recognize the way this coupling forces you down one corridor and doesn't let you go down other multiple possible corridors, then you have to approach any sorts of oral sources and every single textual source with a different methodology. And that requires methodological innovation. And we have gone quick, easy, cheap routes methodologically to try and solve this. This is not a quick, easy, cheap solution. This is decades of scholarly work, and it's slow and painstaking work. And the work, while the methodological work is painful, it's only made worthwhile by the ability, in the meantime, while it's going on, to ask really exciting questions. Because it's the really exciting questions that keep the pulse moving forward. But what it takes from us in both reconceptualizing archive, outside of this dyad of archive and oral tradition, uncoupling ourselves from the notion of oral tradition, which is not to say, and I'm not in a kind of a war with Jeff Perez to say there are no oral traditions. They are, of course they are. There are all sorts of things, but I'm talking at a totally different level, at understanding all the multiple things that are going on in all the multiple possibilities of sources that we have and how we handle them. So I answer your question in this very oblique way of saying it takes all of this work to open the space for the kinds of questions that animate a new generation of young scholars, amongst whom will be the Black historians who are, actually not will be, are already the Black historians who are going to occupy central spaces in the academy. But that's my sense of this, and certainly, you know, I consider it a colossal endeavor, and not for any one person. It's a whole swing.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, and I think that's what. So I mean, the only thing I would add, and of course I agree completely with what Professor Hamilton just said. The only thing that I think I would add to that, as in some ways a crucial qualifier, right, is a notion of contingency. Right. So to go back to what you were saying earlier about this articulation that of a particular kind of archive with oral tradition, right, as a particular response to this particular construction of archive, right, that can only be understood, I think, by taking seriously, the contingent nature of that articulation. Right, and of course, it's one of the most important C's in history, right? Alongside change over time, right? So to say that contingency is something that we need to take much more seriously, in some ways, is to, I think, just take us back to the drawing board and say, history has always been about contingency, right? But we need to take this seriously. In fact, I think one reason, to go back to Atambule's, very well, put observation about whiteness and its place, right? Is that part of the reason, I think, for the displacement of contingency, right, has been this naturalization of certain forms of hierarchy, right? And so, for example, why do the Dutch show up in the Cape in 1652, right? And of course, if you want to naturalize that process, you're going to start talking about, being sent by God to come and civilize the natives, etc., etc. Or if you want to take seriously contingency, right? I'm using a very crude example here. Right? You want to say, well, they're trying to get to Asia, right? And they need a victualling station, right? And the Cape, proves, a good place for this, right? But then out of this contingent encounter between landscape and European ships emerges, right, a particular political economic formation that over time comes to shape us all, in ways both good and bad, right? And so I think saying that at the heart of what we're trying to do, and it is a colossal endeavor, I agree with you, but I think at the heart of it, right, must be, I want to argue, a renewed appreciation of contingency, right? Because there's also one way for me, because I'm also, looking, I'm not just looking to the past, I'm also looking to the present and to the future, and doing all kinds of battles, right? Many of them imagined, right, with nativism, right? And so my insistence on contingency is both historical, historiographical, but also political. Right, because that's one way to get out of this nonsense where somehow there's this line where a particular group of people comes first and then everyone else has to follow. Right, and so this is, I mean, it's a long way to say that the only qualifier I would add is that we need to place contingency at the center of these considerations.
Thank you, Jacob. I'm seeing that in the chat box, conversations are going on. But if someone wants to step in and raise a few of those points, that's absolutely welcome. If there is no immediate question, then I have one, but I would not like to. Yes, Kamalita, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I mean, it will just be a very quick one. And I mean, of course, these are not new conversations. I think, you know, people have been having them and they're not exclusive to South Africa either. Of course, they've already happened in the continent various times. And I mean, just a very simple question, to what extent is this a problem of history? To what extent is this a historiographical problem, or is this a political problem? I mean, that seems to be linked to, I mean, this is because we know that history is a discipline that is so closely linked to nation and the state. And so what you're talking about is a politics of growing indigeneity and identity politics that we see everywhere. And to what extent is this kind of something that you can speak about as a problem that can be located in the discipline of history?
I mean, Kamalita, you know, thank you so much for the question. You're right. I mean, this is actually not unique to South Africa, right? It's not a problem just for South Africa, right? And it's also quite telling, I think, that it's a problem that we pose often, and I'm going to use the capacious way, right? That we pose often as a political problem, right? You know, why are there few Black scholars in the academy in South Africa? Why are there, a few people of color in the profession broadly defined in South Africa, right? So it's not limited to South Africa, but it takes a particular charge in the South African context, and so for the sake of argument, that's what I want to limit myself to, right? But also because I should be able to do this because I've done this in the past, where I've been able to go to the CHE and say, may I please have figures, right? And of course, I can't take those figures at face value, right? And I can't assume that, what the official category is what, the individual category will be, right? And so in some ways I have to work with these figures, but to work with them creatively, right? With this deep appreciation that there is no one-to-one correspondence, right, between category and person, right? And so this for me, I think, is absolutely important. But your point is well taken, right? That this is not limited to South Africa, and that, Vic, we should be, alert to this, right? We should be aware of this, right? That in some ways what we think are unique problems are actually not unique problems, right? The context is different, obviously, and the solutions must necessarily be different, right? If there are to be solutions, right? Yeah, but your point is well taken. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. Sandile.
Dlamini.
So
Wonderful show. Oh, what a provocative discussion you've just kick-started. We really appreciate it. I would also like to suggest, my dear brother, that the points you are raising also related to the ethics of knowledge production within historical studies in South Africa. What is it that we consider to be the imperatives of the hour, and because of certain ethical concerns, decisions that we have made, because in as much as history presents itself on us, it's reading, the reading of history is a proactive act. It's not, it's hardly an accident. So there are certain value formulations that we make today and tomorrow that our predecessors have made in the past. The colonizing mission had its own imperatives, and that drove us to where we are today, apartheid, and so on. And the African nationalism, movement and other movements like Pan-Africanism, Black consciousness, also brought several imperatives somehow that impose themselves on the historian today, and the imperatives, and let me say the ethical dilemmas or choices that they have to be taken today. So I just wanted to add to that, and thank you so much, and also for stating that it's not about centering your position on whiteness and the desire to save it from somebody. It's a broader question. That, you know. So thank you very much, my brother.
Yeah. No, I mean, just to in fact, you know, what Utlamo just said just reminds me of what Robert Danton, the historian, you know, of the French Revolution, you know, says about historians and what we do. That, you know, a historian must tell a good story and must tell the truth, right? You may disagree with that, but I do think there's something to that, right? You know, that we need to tell good stories to make history compelling, to make history, you know, attractive, but also we need to tell the truth, right? And of course, telling the truth, you know, has, you know, ethical injunctions behind it, right? You know, has ethical implications, right, for how we do the work we do, right? And yeah, so I agree fully with what you said, Kosa. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. John, Professor John Wright.
No, thanks, Bodhi. I'd just like to get back to that very important question that Carmelita raised about the connection between history and state formation, seeing it as a political problem. Now, increasingly, I'm speaking personally here, you know, my whole impulse is to say to hell with the state, to hell with nation building. But that raises a huge question of, you know, what comes after it? And who are the citizens of it, whatever it is? And how, as an academic historian, do I want to relate to those citizens and to non-citizens for that matter? So in a nutshell, what comes after the nation state?
Yeah, Professor Wright, So I did some work for SWAP at Wits, you know, years ago, and that work, in fact, I mean, it fed its way into native nostalgia in parts, but we were looking at Peter Thief in light of you know, community protests against, you know, all sorts of, you know, ANC malfeasance, but we're also trying to make sense of, you know, Peter Thief's own transformations, right, since the end of apartheid. And what struck me, and this is actually, I mean, I don't know if you want to call this a metaphor, but one image that has stayed with me, and I find this as an image very helpful for thinking about the relationship between the state and, you know, the state and subject, right? State and citizen, state and you know, and resident. Is that we might actually benefit from thinking, in the South African context especially, of the state as constantly trying to play catch up to the citizen, you know, to the resident, to the subject. And one way to illustrate this is by, and of course, I mean, you know, many of us here, you know, have done work on the Lowveld, so we know, you know, what type of landscape, you know, most of the Lowveld is, especially in those places where there's a lot of granite. And, you know, this has all kinds of, you know, implications for what one can build, where one can build, etc. So you had people who were settling at the, you know, instigation of local, you know, traditional leaders, like so-called, right, local chiefs, who were settling in all kinds of crazy places, right, and then turning to the state and saying to the state, yeah, well, I need tap water, right, I need toilets that flush, right, I need electricity, and, you know, state engineers saying, well, actually, you know, because of the gradient and other factors, that this actually will be impossible for us to do because it would just cost an astronomical amount of money, right? And therefore, you need to move to a different place, right? But because a chief had said, this is your piece, you know, you held on to it with your dear life, right? And so what you ended up with many of these social protests were, you know, the state essentially playing catch up to people, literally running after people, right? So people will go and say, okay, this is where we're going to settle, and this is where we want our toilets. And then the state would have to run after them and say, well, actually, no, what if you move just like 2 kilometers down, or what if you move 2 kilometers this way? Because then that way the gradient is better, we can actually do this, right? And so it's not that the state has disappeared, but the state is constantly playing catch up. And that was my impression, from doing that field work, in Piet Retief. And in some ways, I think this is what we might want to take with us into our classrooms when we talk about South African history. It's not that the state is absent. Of course, the state is not absent. And given the nature of the academy in South Africa, the state can never be absent, right? You need the state for your universities to function, right? But I think thinking in some ways in less instrumental ways about the relationship between state and person might actually be more productive, because it might actually help us see some of the things that we refuse to see, because we still want a state that does service delivery, right? That ugly term that the ANC foisted on everyone. Right? We constantly are looking to the state for service delivery when we should in some ways be trying to look to the state for something different, right? I mean, they still have to do the basics. I'm not saying that the state has to in some ways disengage from being a state in the traditional sense. But when it comes to making sense of relations between persons and states, I think we might want to take a different perspective.
Thank you, Jacob. I'm not seeing any immediate hands, so if I can abuse my position and engage a little bit with you, I want to come to Athambila's point about unpacking and decentering whiteness to a slightly different route. I'm thinking about the boundaries of the professional and the disciplinary. The two domains that in your short address seem to switch places a bit too hastily for me. To me, that seems to be the crux of the question. The blurring of this boundary seems almost inescapable, right? I mean, if I can elaborate a little bit, on paper, the disciplinary stability of historical or historiographical, as you put it, norms and rules, whether it is the question of evidence or the nature of correlation, that can be quite neatly separated on paper from the professional composition of academic historians in terms of race, gender, and similar indices of identity. But at the same time, and here, of course, I'm thinking, for example, of a classic analysis of the American historical profession by Peter Novick, right? That Noble Dream. There has always been a seepage between the abstracted normativity of the discipline and the practiced institutionality of the profession, right? We all know at least of two major moments. The entry of women historians into the profession was often frowned upon by the academic argument that women were naturally intuitive while men were analytic. Just as the entry of non-whites into the profession, was frowned upon or countered by the academic argument that non-whites were naturally subjective and whites naturally objective. Now, what I'm trying to say is that we now look at these arguments as pure prejudice, but those were academic arguments at disciplinary arguments at those particular moments, right? Not merely professional arguments. With the change of professional composition, the disciplinary arguments have changed many, many times over history. And which is not to say, and I'm not at all suggesting that one caused the other in any straightforward way, but there is also some kind of leakage between the two. So what I am wondering about, well, I'm in sympathy with your larger kind of warning. I'm also cannot stop wondering about is whether this attempt to draw a boundary between the professional and the disciplinary is not necessarily a utopic project, right? That which will always try to, despite its best intention, will always have to forget the interconstitution, the co-constitution of these two domains. I'm just thinking with you, it was very provocative, but I would like to hear if you have anything to say on it.
No, Bodhi, I mean, thank you for that, provocative question. Because you're right. So the point you make about, in some ways, these fungible, boundaries, between, the profession and the discipline, right? In some ways, I think echo, Atambile's observation about, some of these figures who, for me, are interesting to think with, right? Soga was not a historian. He was he was a Presbyterian minister, right? And yet, here he is in my story, right? Drawing a distinction between myth and history, right? And making a case for history, right? As a work of preservation. Right, that there's something about the past or something from the past that needs to be preserved, and history is one way to do it, right? And so your point is absolutely well taken. And of course, you're right that in some ways these debates, even though I'm calling them political, they have not been in some ways marginal to the way that the profession has conducted itself, to the way that the discipline has developed. And the Norfolk example is actually a very, very, very good one, right? And the political has always been the historical has always been the political, right? Both within, but also outside of the discipline, right? And so this is something that I think we need to take seriously. But I think there's a way to, in some ways, get at what I'm trying to raise as a problem, right? And your word composition, I think, actually works better than the words that I've been working with, right? I think there's a way to get at the questions of composition without letting the composition of, say, the academic discipline in South Africa, right? Like seep into, automatic diversity, right? Seep into, automatic, empowerment, right? To choose another, another word that comes, to us laden, with all kinds of meaning, right? And what I'm trying to do, and I'm gonna have to think through what you're saying, but what I'm trying to do in some ways is to see what might happen, right? And of course, I mean, it's not a story about preserving whiteness. I have no interest in that. I have no desire, right? I mean, I certainly have an interest in hearing many more people come, come onto the field and do much more interesting work with all kinds of skills and language, sets, etc. Right? I mean, this is my interest, right? But I want to, in some ways, see what happens. Again, this is an expression I overuse, and I'm going to use it here to see what might happen to how we do history if we cut race down to analytical size, right? So not get rid of it completely, but just cut it down to analytical size, right? And so have those moments and recognize those moments where race itself helps us understand something of what's going on, but also have those moments where race doesn't always explain everything, right? And this, in some ways, comes out of my experience with work that I've done. So one of the stories I tell, so I can just illustrate this point, and I'll shut up here. About what it might mean to cut race down to analytical size is the story of father, son, Odurile Maponya, ANC insurgent, and his father, Joseph Maponya. The father is an informant for the security police, informing on the son, right? And here, race doesn't tell you much, right? In some ways, there's a limit to what race can do to help you understand why father would spy on son, right? With devastating effect. In fact, I think to understand why another of his sons, Japi Maponya, is killed by the security police, you have to understand, what the father spying means to the security police, right? And the one way to understand this, in fact, the only way that I was able to make sense of this, right, was by understanding something of the family dynamics, right? But was by understanding something of, this very fraught relation between father and son, right? The fact that the parents had divorced and that this had destroyed whatever relationship father and son had, right? And so the father didn't feel beholden in any way to the son, and so was more than happy to sell the son under the security police, right? And so here's one example. It's a very crude example, and I write at length about this in the Terrorist album, where race doesn't actually take you anywhere if what you're trying to understand is why father would do this to son. right? And so that's what I'm trying to do. I mean, it's a clumsy, messy response to your question, Bodhi, but I mean, I have to work with this, right? I mean, I have to work with this, but I mean, this is, you know, in my defense, this is what I'm trying to do, to cut and raise down to analytical size, and to have it work where we need it to work, but also to have it not, you know, dominate where we actually don't need it to dominate. So this is what I'm trying to do. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Manda, please, go ahead. Dr. Manda Malaud.
Thanks, Professor Dlamini, for your really provocative intervention. It will help us a lot to think about this, some of these issues. I'm wondering, and in some ways, it follows on the question that Bodhi was asking about the blurring of the and other people, profession and the discipline. And I'm wondering about, okay, Soga is not an historian, yet he claims history, doesn't want to destroy history. And that there's this sort of distinction between academic history and what, non-academic history. How useful is it to simply divide it in terms of its institutional location without looking more carefully at what I think you were insisting on, perspective? A Black scholar is not necessarily going to have a different perspective, and that might not really take us anywhere. And so I'm wondering about the usefulness of insisting on, you know, one, the divisions between academic and non-academic, yet the figure of history itself is not necessarily being rejected or even rethought, more importantly, and what that does. Thanks.
Yeah. I mean, Professor Malawi, thank you so much for, you know, for your question. In some ways, I think the question you're asking, and the question, you know, in some ways connects to some of these other concerns that we've heard, goes to the heart of what it might mean to think of history as a democratic endeavor, right? I think your question goes to the, you know, to the very heart of what it might mean to say we want to democratize history, right? And to do that, I think, in ways that allow us to, I mean, to go back to you know, Professor Hamilton's, you know, observation that, you know, might allow us to in some ways go back to oral traditions and oral histories, you know, fully aware of their articulation with a particular kind of archive, right? You know, fully aware that at some level, to understand what oral tradition and oral history are and are trying to do, you have to understand what it is that they're responding to, right? In time, right? You have to, you know, in some ways understand how they co-constituted by this, you know, peculiar notion, you know, of archive, right? So there's, I think there's some of that going on, and of course, you know, there's got to be a limit to, I think, what we claim for, you know, history and its potential for democratization, in the sense that, you know, while we all tell stories, right? You know, very few of us, you know, become, you know, historians, and very few of us, you know, join the academy and actually use the academy to pursue the kind of work that we want to, you know, pursue, right? So that not everyone becomes a historian, right? And in much the same way that not every Black person, you know, can speak, you know, the same way about the experience of apartheid, right? Again, this is another messy answer to what is a very good question. But your question is actually making me think about what it might mean for us to think about the extent to which we can, you know, offer to democratize history, and the extent to which, you know, we can't do that, because by definition, this is an elite endeavor that is limited to a relatively small group of people.
Thank you, Jacob. Any other questions, comments? Cynthia, please. Professor Cynthia Cross.
Hi, Jacob. Hi. I think that the quotations you attributed to me also from John. I think they're from our joint work on. Yeah. Well,
I apologize.
I mean, it's hard for us to tell now who said what. We can't remember ourselves. But we've talked a lot about these issues for our forthcoming book.
I apologize, John. Right?
No, I'm sure. Well, I hope he's not offended. But yeah, I mean, they come out of collaboration and lots of talking. So, yeah, I was just thinking though, your example. Yes, I mean, I think the reason, you know, I sat in a history department for 18 years, which had no other women in it. So that would also be something to think about. And I felt extremely uncomfortable. You know, it was hard for me to write history under those conditions. And I think one of the things was that you had to tell, I felt like you had to tell such big stories, you know, whereas the kind of stories that you're talking about, like trying to figure out the motivations of individuals and family dynamics, actually interest me a great deal more. So I found that interesting. But yeah, and I'd love to really spend a lot of time thinking about what is it that has been so inhibiting really about the discipline of history. And, you know, so in this environment that I'm operating in now, I find, you know, I feel much freer, much more, you know, able to work on the kind of things that I really want to work on. But gosh, you know, I'm at the end of my career. So it's rather sad in that way. Yeah. Anyway, thanks. It was very, very thought-provoking. I really enjoyed what you had to say.
Yeah. No, thank you so much. I mean, I feel blessed and I feel lucky in that I have, you know, a formidable lineup of historians in whose footsteps I'm trying to follow, and Cynthia Cross is one of them. So I feel blessed by that. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Jacob, for giving us the time and for this lively, thought-provoking lecture. And I'm sure we are going to continue debating these issues over the next 2 days in the conference and even after. It's been fabulous and fantastic, and thank you. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah.
So,
no, yeah. No, I should thank you, Bodhi. Thank you so much for making this possible. I'm like, I shouldn't repeat this too often, but I gave a talk once, and a friend, in fact, I used to work for 702, came up to me afterwards and said, you know, you write better than you speak. So I'm hoping that when I do finally commit this to paper, it will sound coherent, and will sound, you know, well thought out. But thank you so much for you know, giving me a chance to share my messy thoughts with you. And this is very much a work in progress, and I'm not quite sure which way I want to go with it. But just to have you give me the opportunity to just, you know, to share, you know, with you is special to me. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. The pleasure was all ours. Let's give a big round of applause to Professor Dlamini. And with that, we conclude the first day of History Access conference. Tomorrow, we have our second plenary address at 9 a.m. So I hope to see all of you there. And thank you, Jacob. Thank you
so much
for making this possible.
Yeah, take care.
And thanks to the audience for being here and engaging, Jacob.
Thanks. Yeah.
Have a good evening.